Wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, as well as for having me. When I advance it, I just push this button? No, that's my pointer. Here we go. Okay, so this is an image of the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, which, as probably all of you know, is an island, nation, city, state that is off the coast of Southeast Asia. And this image comes from an article, 52 Places to Go in 2015, that was published in the New York Times on January 9th, 2015. Singapore is a city-state in flux, an island nation in Southeast Asia that has transformed itself from a former British trading post for the East India Company, became independent in 1963, into one of the world's major commercial hubs. Quote, Singapore, as the curator Lee Wen Choi remarked, imagines itself not just as taking the best from the East and the West, the inheritor of the great traditions and the latest technologies, but by offering itself as the paradigm of New Asia, Singapore stakes a claim as the vanguard of the next stage of capitalism. A city nation of skyscrapers and shopping malls that is perpetually under construction, Singapore has sought to transform itself into a tourist destination by supporting contemporary art and artists. This support comes with a price, however, as the National Arts Council encourages organizers, curators, and artists to produce exhibitions and events that have a broad appeal to the general public. In this paper, I propose to address the role of the audience vis-a-vis the annual performance festival Future of the Imagination, FOI. Under the artistic direction of Lee Wen and currently Jason Lim, FOI has remained an anti-nationalistic festival that would provide an alternative to Singapore's rapacious economic expansion and desire for user-friendly, crowd-pleasing events, while evading the government licensing restrictions that limited the possibilities of performance events to begin with. To be part of the audience who attends these performances, many of which are deliberately esoteric and limited to a small number of, quote, in-the-know viewers, is to resist the homogenized construction of what Lee Wen has termed the man in the street. The audience for events such as FOI, composed of artists, organizers, and locals who have wandered into the space, so the locals are the surprised, non-art-going audience, expose the cracks and fissures of Singapore's self-presentation as an exotic, yet hardly foreign destination in the New Asia. And I should also mention the national language in Singapore, because it was a colony, is English. Sorry. So this is a newspaper article on the Artist Village, and this is a photograph of the members of the Artist Village circa 1989. In the past, Singapore's semi-authoritarian government has had a reputation for suppressing civil liberties and political rights in all sectors of society, including that of the arts. In the mid to late 80s, performance art in Singapore was decidedly anti-authoritarian and politically subversive, taking place in alternative spaces under the auspices of non-state sanctioned spaces, such as the Artist Village, TAV, founded by Tang Bao Wu. In 1994, as part of the Artists' General Assembly, organized by TAV, Joseph Ng, kind of hard to pronounce that name, and Shannon Tom Kwok Leong performed during the New Year's Eve program at the Fifth Passage Gallery, which was situated in a shopping mall. So the image on the left is actually a kind of tabloid photograph of Joseph Ng's performance, which got him arrested, and then on the right is a newspaper article about a reenactment of this very important performance, which was done more recently by Lu Zihan in Chicago in 2011. I think Defibrillator Gallery was involved with this, but I'm not sure. Jessica probably would know. By the time that Ng and Tom had performed, the festival, which included a film screening, had already had 2 films censored for homosexual subject matter and inflammatory political content. Tom's performance engaged with the sensationalistic coverage of the festival by the new paper, known as TNP, and this is the new paper performing Ng's, or rather covering Ng's piece on the left. And then Ng's performance was even more controversial. Entitled Brother Cane, the performance alluded to a caning sentence that had recently been meted out to a number of men who had been charged as the result of an anti-gay entrapment operation. The performance itself was quiescent and meditative, with Ng creating a circle of objects that included 12 newspaper clippings relating the incident. After stating that clipping hair could be a form of silent protest, Ng, his back to the audience, cut some of his pubic hair, which he placed in the center of the circle. Upon conclusion of the piece, police raided the gallery. Ng and his collaborators were arrested while the audience members scattered. Following the incident, the Singapore National Arts Council decided to cease funding performance. This is the NEA4, Finley, Fleck, Hughes, and Miller. Singapore is not the only country to withhold funds for the artist based on a nebulous standard of public decency. In 1990, just a few years prior to the Brother Cane controversy, the U.S. National Endowment for the Arts denied funding for a performance artist based on alleged obscenity in the work, even though all 4 artists had already passed a rigorous review process. The NEA4, as these artists were collectively known, successfully sued the NEA and recouped their grants. Their notoriety, far from hurting their careers, helped to increase their visibility, with the result that they performed frequently in the U.S. and abroad, often to capacity audiences. The Singaporean artists and audiences, by contrast, were confronted with a loss of support that signified official disapproval to the public at large. It also made it very dangerous for audiences to attend any performances because they could be arrested and they could also face repercussions beyond simply their performance career, but in their life itself. So this image here is of Ho Tzu Nguyen performing episode 3 in honor of Tang Bao Wu, the most radical gesture from 4x4 episodes of Singapore art by Ho Tzu Nguyen, curated by Weng Choi Lee, the Singaporean art historian and curator. And it's interesting, it's actually a reenactment of a performance that Tang Bao Wu, who was the founder of the Artist Village, did. So faced with the real possibility of being blacklisted or arrested, most artists chose not to challenge the system. For the next 10 years, performance art in Singapore went underground, with artists either deciding to perform without permission or, more commonly, to perform outside of the country. It is in this context that the guerrilla performance of Tang Bao Wu at the opening ceremony of Singapore Art 95 can be seen as an act of great courage. After having arranged an introduction to the President of Singapore, Tang handed President Ong Teng Cheong a card that read, "Dear Mr. President, I am an artist. I am important. Yours sincerely, Tang Bao Wu." And you can kind of see that that's what this sign says here. So this is a reenactment of Tang's performance. Tang then slipped on a black dinner jacket with the words, "Don't give money to the arts," visible to all present, embroidered in gold thread on the back. And this is an image of Lee Wen, Journey of a Yellow Man, number 16, Southern Man, Northern Exposure in Copenhagen City Square. In spite of Tang's courage, it would be 8 years before performance art would be once again officially sanctioned in Singapore. In the 10 years between Ng's Brother Cane and the resumption of funding for difficult art, Singapore had transformed itself into an international economic powerhouse and postmodern city-state. Official tolerance for avant-garde art was one of the ways by which the Singaporean government indicated that it had broken from its totalitarian past. In 2003, the National Arts Council resumed funding for performance art. In response, artist Lee Wen, pictured here, organized the first Future of the Imagination, which took place at the Substation, a contemporary art center located in Singapore. From the onset, FOI was very different from state-sponsored events such as Singapore Art Week and the Biennale. Although FOI was still subject to the licensing restrictions imposed by the government, the work included in the 8 iterations of FOI has consistently pushed the envelope of what is and is not acceptable for public display. A festival devoted primarily to difficult durational performances, FOI was and is modeled on the do-it-yourself events that had been organized by Dong and the Artist Village in the 80s. Lee, a former member of the Artist Village, is best known in Singapore for his Yellow Man performances, in which he covers his body with yellow poster paint to highlight his ethnic Chinese identity. For many years, Lee had been a member of Black Market International, a collective that performs collaborative durational actions in performance festivals all over the world. Concerned that FOI not be lumped in with other government-sponsored art events which serve to bolster Singapore's reputation as a global economic power, Lee used his connections from Black Market International in order to curate a festival of challenging work that required a dedicated audience that did not mind engaging with performances that defied explanation, lasted a long time, and refused to conform to neoliberal ideas about productive labor and discrete units of time. Lee wanted to create an anti-festival vis-a-vis the traditional festivals sponsored by the Singaporean government. As he put it, quote, Singapore has an ambition to not only be an economic hub, but also a cultural center, hence all of the Renaissance city hype. So it was no surprise when funding and recognition were reinstated in 2003. But official events like the Singapore Biennale and Arts Festival tend towards entertaining and user-friendly type kind of performances. So there is still a role for independent initiatives presenting the experimental stuff which may not appeal to wider audiences. However, the funding bodies do not differentiate, and they expect us to be equally safe and appealing, so it remains challenging. For Lee, the challenge came in organizing an anti-nationalistic festival that would provide an alternative to Singapore's rapacious economic expansion and desire for user-friendly, crowd-pleasing events, while evading the licensing restrictions that limited the possibilities of semi-public, government-funded events. FOI's title was ironic, a future based not on the exchange of commodities and money, but on imagination, which is unquantifiable. With FOI, Lee created a program of difficult work. From the beginning, FOI was dependent on the Arts Council, and yet, as Lee noted in his introductory essay for FOI 6, the increased in-state support and funding today for conceptual and performance art does not translate easily to an augmented art market. This may actually be a blessing in disguise, as it remains perpetually negating its own commercialization and commodification by default. From the onset, Lee Wen used FOI as a platform to thumb his nose at the government, using their money in order to construct a performance art festival where artists skated on the edge of public decency and tourists entered at their own risk. FOI 9, curated by Jason Lim, who's pictured here, performing at Rapid Pulse International 2014, continued the tradition of anti-establishment art established by Lee Wen. For FOI 9, which was the most recent iteration, 2014, time was an important component. The theme of the festival was duration, with most of the performances lasting for 2+ hours and many going on for much longer. So here is the advertisement for FOI 9 with Marilyn Arsom as the cover girl. And I should mention that Marilyn Arsom was one of the founders of Mobius, and the woman who stole the lobster from Anya actually was the Mobius director for many years. So they're very closely connected. in any case, let's see, with most of the performances lasting for 2+ hours and many going for much longer. Adrian Heathfield has suggested that the phenomenon of duration is both irreducible and non-representable. For Heathfield, durational aesthetics was a means by which the accelerated temporality of late capitalism could be countered. Quote, denaturalizing and dehabitualizing perceptions of time, durational aesthetics are a vital means through which the nature and values of these powers may be opened up, their regulatory grip loosened. For Lee, first, and Lim, currently, durational, difficult performance that challenged and engaged the audience was a means, and is a means, by which the regulatory grip of late capitalism, dependent upon a passive audience who simply watches, could be loosened. I would like to point out to you, though, that there's a certain irony in this poster in that all of the sponsors are so kind of prominently featured. It reminds me a bit of the collector's seals on Chinese scrolls from the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. But there's always this tension between sponsors, capitalism. Singapore is one of the biggest kind of destinations for large corporations to have offices in Asia, and then what's actually happening at FOI. So much of the work in FOI was quiescent, an immersive experience based on the physical actions of the artists that were enhanced through the use of specific objects and settings. This quiescence was epitomized in the opening night performance of Inari Virmakoski's Groundwork, pictured here. Groundwork gestured elegantly to lives that have been lived and pasts that exist only in memory. Virmakoski collects objects from places she has been and carries them to the next location where she will be going. In this way, she carries place and sight on her person while staying grounded in what really matters, hence the title of the piece. Marilyn Arsum's Making Time, 4, pictured here, Sakiko Yamoka's Relocation number 1, and Boris, and that's pictured here, and then Boris Nislony's Koan, addressed temporality, pictured here. I hope you can see it. It's a little hard to see. Addressed temporality and audience expectations as well. Making Time 4 was a 6-hour meditation on memory, loss, and death. Arsum's partner, the photographer Bob Raymond, had passed away in 2011. For those aware of Arsum's history, the performance was an extended memorial. It's also sort of an extended memorial for the viewers as well, many of whom moved in and out of the space. Using cast-off furniture that she had collected in the surrounding streets, Yamoaka painstakingly moved and rearranged the furniture for 6 hours, pausing only for a scheduled tea break with the audience. Yamoaka's exhaustion was palpable as she heroically attempted to complete her Sisyphean task, and then all of this furniture that had been discarded, it was no longer necessary, was returned to the piles of refuge in the street that were there to be taken away. Nislony's Koan, the closing performance for the festival, if you can't see, he's sort of over there. It was a very, very dark piece, literally dark, was aptly named after the Zen Buddhist parable or riddles that are non sequiturs and initially make no sense. For 2 hours in almost total darkness, Nislony felt along the brick surface of the wall, pausing at certain points to strike it with a hammer. Almost nothing happened for the duration of the performance. Koan was a refutation of what Nislony has termed the technologies of efficiency, which must fulfill predefined social, economic, and cultural goals and models. And in fact, the ending of Koan was anticlimactic. After sitting in this very, very hot space for a long time, he put a light on the tree, and then it was done. Nothing much happened. And although we were taking pictures, actually, the artist furnished these pictures to me, it was fairly hard to take pictures. It was very different from La Ribot, where there's an idea of posing and an understanding that it will, in fact, appear on social media. The elements of stretched and distorted time, a time that demands much of the audience along with the performer, point to Lee's and now Lim's attempt to organize a festival that provides an alternative to the more tourist-friendly festivals and exhibitions that the National Arts Council normally supports. Staged in the old Post Museum on Rowell Road, FOI 9 unfolded in the heart of Little India. There's Rowell Road, home base for many of the migrant workers that are employed to build Singapore's skyscrapers, casinos, and shopping malls. Throughout the festival, these disenfranchised and diasporic participants, Singaporeans, all of them male, could be found mingling with the art audiences, watching and in some cases participating in the performances. Singapore, a city-state with a colonial past and a neoliberal present, is hardly a model for social equality and justice. Nor was Lim concerned with addressing Singapore's social inequities with neoliberal feel-good programming. So this wasn't about getting the locals who lived on Rowell Road, which also, by the way, is where a lot of the prostitution is located. It wasn't about getting them to participate or going out into the community and making a statement about economic disparity. Instead, the structure of the festival, along with its location, made visible the cracks and fissures in contemporary Singapore as locals jostled with the international art crowd, university students, and artists. On the opening night of the festival, Wanton Wuma's performance Blood, Sacrifice, and Memory, pictured here, ended when Wuma, who had spent the previous hour and a half covering the performance space and his body with crumpled newspapers, burst out of the space and into the street, running down the alley across the street, or actually perpendicular to Rowell Road. What was interesting is he drew a crowd. He had the normal kind of art crowd following after him, myself included, with cell phone cameras, taking pictures as we went. And then, of course, he had the Rowell Road residents, some of whom you can see a bit in the background. The following night, Alistair McLennan performed Fell Tell in an alley that ran parallel to Rowell Road. McLennan, his feet bare, a piece of cloth clutched in his hand, and a book and a shoe balanced on his head, walked from one end of the alley and back again, very, very slowly, while pausing at a small installation that he had set up with rocks, coconut, and a blanket. And what was very interesting on this night is that unlike Wuma, who immediately drew a crowd and made the paper in a rather sensationalistic manner, McLennan's piece went virtually unnoticed by those passing through the alley. People sort of looked and passed away. It was only an art crowd of about 4 to 5 at any given point, in spite of the fact that this was Friday night and there's a number of restaurants around. On Saturday night, the outdoor performance drew a larger crowd. Valerian Malay and Clara Schillinger performed Singapore Permutation, which was a piece based on tone, colors, actions, and the moving of letters, where they played with all of the various permutations of the word Singapore. By this time, everyone was out. It's a little hard to see from this picture just how much of a crowd it was. The performance in this case resulted in the arrival of the police, and Lim, who was present, immediately had to produce the necessary documentation for holding this performance. What was also interesting about this was that people would ride their bicycles right through the performance. So there wasn't a sense of preciousness, but there was a sense of a kind of an event going on. So for me, in this context of the engagement with art audience, Singaporeans, but disenfranchised Singaporeans, so this is sort of the other side of town from the, I think it's Victoria Road with the large white buildings and the shopping malls, was Daniela Beltrani's piece, Sown. And Daniela is pictured here with actually just a local. Deceptively simple, the piece consisted of Beltrani inviting an audience member to join her on a mat, select a colored thread, and sew him or herself to Beltrani. After an initially very slow start, where Beltrani first conscripted her son, and then basically was sewn to a number of the art community, including members of her artist group SPAM. The locals who'd been gathering and been getting more and more interested decided they were going to participate too. So one by one, they sat down with Beltrani. I think what's very interesting, particularly in this case, is you can probably see that Beltrani is a very, very beautiful woman. And there was one of the write-up of the piece that's on the FOI online catalog talked about, it was a friend of Beltrani's, I'll talk about this in a minute, but he talked about how he had some concern for Beltrani's safety while watching this piece. Anyway, making no distinction between the art crowd and the local crowd. Beltrani sat gazing lovingly at the person to whom she was attached for many minutes. The Indian migrant workers, who were Beltrani's primary audience within about 30 to 45 minutes, are other to the more affluent Singaporeans, a group to which Beltrani, an Italian immigrant, curator, artist, and former lawyer, belongs. Beltrani's Sown did not necessarily dissolve that otherness, but it did provide a model by which one can begin to acknowledge another's humanity or even right to exist. This is Beltrani with her collaborator, Naresh Subhash, who was ultimately the reviewer of the piece. Reviewing the piece, Naresh Subhash, who also participated, wrote, Daniela's work takes this sociological element that demands that we reassess the way we see these men, humanizes them, and deconstructs the, quote, otherness. The fascinating element here is that it is through the other, Daniela, that we reconstruct humanity of the other, worker, and in turn relegating the term other to something that cannot exist in the experience of this work. Beltrani's performance, and this is me speaking again, originally scheduled for 2 hours, continued for much longer as Beltrani refused to turn anyone away. Her self-abnegation did not dissolve the difference between her person, the art audience, and the local men. It did point to a way that the Singaporeans who build but don't represent the city might be incorporated into a public spectacle that actually includes what Lee has termed the man on the streets. It does it in a very imperfect way, obviously. Anyway, to conclude, Singapore, Lee Wen Choi writes, appropriates plurality and radicality. It is totally committed to progress and an Asian essentialism that has less to do with advocating cultural diversity than with disciplining its society to be economically competitive. For Lee Wen Choi, the most pressing question is how to theorize and practice in art a critique of the spectacle. FOI managed this through art that refused its spectacularity and in the process provided the audience with something entirely different. It was also art that, in the words of Li Wen-choi, allowed for moments when, quote, the audience sees itself looking and sees another audience, this one unmarked as an audience, let alone an art audience, which then also sees itself looking, quote unquote. This doubling and redoubling of the spectacle, along with the deconstruction of Singapore, which happened in the case of the Singapore Permutation performance, was apparent throughout FOI 9, but at no time more than on the closing evening. So this is an image of the performance artist Janusz Baldiga from Poland, performing the Axis of Return 360. And it's a little hard to see, but I'd like to point out the Rowell Road audience who crammed against the windows. They actually stood on boxes to see this. At no time were they turned away from the door of the space. In fact, every so often, one of them would walk through the space to use the bathroom. But they wanted to stand in the window for whatever reason, and so they're just slammed against the window while Baldush executes this performance of very simple actions over the period of 3 hours. By the fourth night, most of the local men had cousined on to the fact that something unusual was happening at Rowell Road. Thus, Janusz Baldiga's The Axis of Return 360, a 3-hour performance that involved creating axes of objects with simple tools in the object's body. So I thought about Megan's presentation. He always moved in a perfect circle, basically. Was attended by an eager and international art audience who shared the performer's space. And here's one of them. Most of the audience was with me, taking the picture on the other side. And a no less eager and possibly even more engrossed non-art audience who pressed against the window, standing on crates and boxes in order to see. The contrast between the crowd within and the crowd without, and here's the crowd without, was stark, a clash of two versions of Singapore, neither of which exactly fits the Singaporean commitment to progress and Asian essentialism. Somehow, this performance was an apt ending to this festival. Thank you.